Okay.
With the impetus that the movement already had over there, it just took off like wildfire. And by the time I'd been involved a month, and they had 6 other men lined up, no women, so happened, from the various communities, men who had not sought the job of being on that board, but whom these leaders thought would be good, believe it or not. And of course, that makes you feel good to think that they had that much confidence in you. I was still pretty scared of the idea, but it moved fast, and by within 60 days, we had the plans all set for a general election over a whole population of 230 or 40,000 people in the whole district to vote yes or no on shall we have a community college with the agreement with the state of their sharing in the financing it. And that was set for March the 12th, 1966. And the thing was carried, 3 or 4 to 1. Big deal. And of course, there was great celebration, everybody. But then the real nitty-gritty started for those 7 of us. Now, I had been naive enough to think that since the steering committee had taken such a bold stand and said, we have 7 people picked that we'd like to see on this board, and openly backed us, I was naive enough to think that nobody else would run, maybe. Well, before I knew what had happened, there were a total of 18. And 3 or 4 from the University of Illinois, and some pretty prominent people. And I was literally scared to death. That's what I'd got myself into. But I wasn't going to back up then. And we went through a series of public meetings called deliberately to acquaint the people with what was going on. And several of the outspoken candidates among the other 11 out of the 18 took shots at us for that the whole thing was rigged. It was a scheme to grab certain people and put them in. And they started such propaganda saying that so-and-so that helped promote this in the beginning, he wants to be president of it, and another one wants to be something else. And it's all a put-up deal. Well, of course, we had to defend ourselves. But one of the things that made it easier for me and allayed some of my fears was that I did not have to ask them to vote for me, but to vote for the representatives that the steering committee had picked, vote for the 7 of us. But anyway, it came out, and we set the date for the election of trustees as soon as the law would allow, which turned out to be May the 7th, 1966. And despite all my fears, I ranked way up to the top. I was all through the evening on television as they were reporting the votes. I was leading the whole bunch. But one of the other 7 passed me right at the end. I think he had an extra bunch of friends in his district or something up at Gibson City that got in there and voted, and he passed me by 50 votes or so, but which is only a small matter. But then I was in, and then the going got really be something when we got established. And here we were, a board. The state furnishes us with $100,000 of startup money. That looked like an awful lot of money to me, but it didn't last long when we started getting a payroll going. Then, of course, we got into the problem of who was going to be president. And one of the fine men who had done a lot of service in helping promote this whole thing from the university wanted to be president. And I was one of the outspoken ones who said in private meetings, we must not start out under the thumb of the University of Illinois. It's a great institution, but this is something else entirely, and we can't be a stepchild of the university. And for that reason, I had to oppose this man, whom I had known well and respected as an educator. but I just knew that he'd bring a whole bunch of associates with him from the university staff, and it would become a satellite of the university. Well, to shorten the story, he was given every consideration and was one of the 5 finalists when it came time to hire a president. And the night before we were going to vote as to which man we'd have, the chairman of our board, who was had a lot of moxie, he kind of knew his way around, he said, let's take a straw vote, not counting, just write it down, slide it in. Well, this man from the university got 3 of the 7 votes. Bill Starkle got 2. And I had voted, as a matter of courtesy, for the man that I had sponsored, one of the candidates from North Carolina. In fact, we'd had him at the house here overnight. So I felt duty bound in that case, knowing that he wasn't quite experienced enough to be the man. And I came home very discouraged. I said, we're going to lose this battle. We're going to end up with the university man for president. And that won't be good. But the tide turned rapidly the next night, and in just no time, Starkle was in. He was that much ahead of all the others. And of course that caused some feelings that we turned down the university man. But and he was pretty hot on the collar for a while, and one of his chief backers, one of the doctors from Carl, a very prominent man in Urbana who has since died, wrote us a nasty letter, at least he did me, berated us but we stuck to our guns, and we were all agreed, so we didn't have that to worry about. And we hadn't asked for the job of trustee in the first place. They had selected us. That made it a little bit easier. Well, it turned out, and incidentally, there's a picture of the product, Parkland up there. It turned out that Bill Starkle was head and shoulders above the others. And within 3 years or so, this man from the university who had not been given the job, I don't know how many of them he wrote to, but he wrote me, and he said, I want to tell you, I couldn't possibly have done what Bill Starkle achieved. Couldn't possibly have done. He was practically as old as I am. He was almost 65 years old himself, and Starkle was 45 at that time. And I've had a very good relationship with this man ever since. But for a while, it was kind of one of those things you have to go through with if you're going to be on a board like that. And we went through a good many things on the selection of a site, because there were various people that wanted to sell their land. And the city of Rantoul had a very enterprising chamber of commerce. And they went out and took options, paid for an option on 160 acres of fine land, and got a lot of pledges. Hadn't been collected, of course. Got a lot of pledges from Rantoul citizens, Chamber of Commerce and all, going to give us a site of 160 acres. Well, we knew that we would be criticized very much if we turned it down, but it was not the center of the district. It was too close to the army base, the military base, and mothers sending their girls to college would not appreciate that. You couldn't say that out loud, but and we also knew that it wasn't centrally located. And we found out that they couldn't have handled the utilities like the Illinois Power could, because they were under a different one. And we eventually found out, too, that that donation they were making was mostly in pledges, which we would have had to collect afterwards. So, and there were a lot more ups and downs. Busey Woods and the old Champaign County Fairgrounds was proposed, and we had to turn down several. But the minute we got on this one, where we are, up on that hill, the very day we went up there to look it over, all 7 of us plus Starkle, it was kind of an interesting interesting experience. The land was not being farmed by the widowed lady who lived in the big old farmhouse, which has since been torn down. Had some relatives, a son-in-law, I believe it was, who kind of liked to be self-appointed spokesman. And I think they wanted $3,000 an acre, which at that time was pretty doggone high. And we ended up jockeying around quite a little bit, but we got it for $2,700 and some dollars. But we paid $723,000 for that land and had turned down a free site at Rantoul. Well, that's pressure on you to make those decisions. But we were together all the way on it, and that makes it easier than if it had been a 4-3 vote. But anyway, and Bill Starkle, of course, was by that time definitely our leader, and knew his way around. So we ended up with this site. I remember that day we went up there. This Mrs. Ealer was her name. Oh, she must have been 10 years old now. Well, she must have been 75. And we stopped at the big house on the way up the hill to look at the site, the spot we wanted. We bought 230 acres. And she wasn't at home. Well, our chairman, Bill Froome, Champaign banker, said, he said, courtesy says that we should not go up there without talking to her first. But she used to be my Sunday school teacher, and I can straighten it out with her. I can take care of it, which he did eventually. But we got almost all the way up, and there were quite a number of trees and bushes and stuff around at that time. And here we went around a little bend in the trees, and here was Mrs. Ealer picking blackberries with her old clothes on. Picking blackberries. Well, needless to say, the situation was a little embarrassing for a moment, but Bill Froome was equal to the occasion, and he smoothed it over, and we apologized for having trespassed on her land, but she was not in too bad a mood. And I remember seeing, as soon as we got up there where we're at the spot, here was Route 57 just completed along there. Here was 72 just coming in from Monticello, about to be completed. And I said, this is where it has to be. Well, nobody else was quite that enthusiastic, but it wasn't long until that's what happened. It became unanimous, and we clinched that. And a little bit of the history of that deal is rather significant here. The Champaign Park Board was very cooperative, and there was a strip of land between what we wanted and where the commercial developments are. And they said, well, we're about ready to buy another 100 or so acres of land, and we will buy that and make a buffer between you, so that you won't ever have a business for hamburger stands and filling stations right on the edge of your campus. So we made that deal, and we bought it at the same time. I don't know what they paid for theirs, but a little bit less, I think, because we got the choice spot. Then when it came time that we got that all settled, Starkle said, it's time we got a name for this place. And he wanted to know if it would be all right if he put out some publicity and had a contest, let people submit names. Well, in just no time at all, we had 75 or 100 names, and many of them would have been names of pioneer families or former statesmen, governors, and so forth of the state. And but none of the names caught on. Some of them were rather ridiculous. But at one meeting, when it was getting about time to settle things, Dean Swank, who is vice president, has been there ever since Starkle came, mentioned in his quiet way, somebody suggested Parkland. Just caught on like that. I said, I move it be Parkland Community College. The old folks said, that's too long, Barnes. And I said, okay, leave out the community. Parkland College. Because we had made a deal with the park board, and we're going to have parkland next to us, and here we were, Parkland College. Well, it just turned out that Lincoln Land and Lakeland and Richland, all in this one unit, all three of those came up with the land on the end of their names, but
Here, I thought that was planned all along.
no, that's how that name came. We just discarded all those other names that the good people had suggested, and where Dean Swank got it, I don't know, but Jesus quietly, just casually mentioned it, and we just took it up and ran with it, and that it became Parkland and had a name right now, forevermore. And I have been, I was for 12 years then. I served 4 terms. I was reelected 3 times after that first one, and always worried about it, about being too old and getting beat and I would have really been let down had I ever been voted out. But then at the end, in about the last year or next to the last year of my 4th term, I told Starkle, I said, I'm developing a hearing problem. Well, in fact, I told him the term before, that I believed I'd better get off I better quit while I was ahead. But I said, I don't really want to. Well, then what are you talking about quitting for? So I went ahead and ran. But this time, I was losing some hearing, and night driving was becoming a little more of a problem. And of course, I'd be 77 or 8 years old at the end of that term. So I finally convinced him that I meant it, and came home and immediately got after Dick Odell to agree to let us run him in my place. And when he finally said yes over Emma's wishes, she didn't want him to. But not that she was adamant against it, but he said he would, and he said, I'll campaign too. He did a lot better job campaigning than I ever did. So he was elected, and well, you know what happened this last election. We don't need to put that in there, I guess, for this, but he's on again. And this was by far the, other than family and marriage and children and all, was the highlight of my whole existence. And it all came after I was 65 years old. And I have plaques from this is from the State Trustees Association, because I was the Parkland representative for those 12 years on the State Association, and was made the reports from state and got acquainted with a lot of the college presidents around the state as well as board members. In fact, I know more presidents now than I do trustees, because the trustees are changing. They're voting them out over an awful lot. And the presidents, of course, Starkle is the one that's been there the longest. He's in his 16th year. And Parkland has been the most successful venture from a variety of angles of all the things that I've been connected with in my lifetime. And I felt very humbly thankful that I got that break and was able to become a part of a great movement like this that is serving the needs of so many people who are being swept under the rug as far as higher education is concerned. And of course, a lot of the top-notch students are starting at Parkland too and going on for their baccalaureate degrees. But it has really been a wonderful experience.
You were very lucky to have it, and we were very lucky to have you so active in it.
I suppose maybe. I was lucky to be in it anyway.
What other community projects and activities have you been in Monticello?
Well, I got to be a member of the city council in a much simpler way, but exactly the same way as I got to be a member of that board. Andy Anderson, who's just retired from the state bank, was mayor then, and he called me one night, and I'll tell you what he said. He said, "I'd like to have you run for alderman." I said, "Oh, I'm not interested in politics." This was in April 1957. And well, I said, "You're a registered Republican." He said, "Around here in these days, you're just a shoe-in. You don't have to campaign." I said, "Well, I wouldn't campaign." And he said, "I'll tell you one of the reasons I especially want you on there." He said, "We just have the 2 taverns here in town, and we have a very good relationship with them. But," he said, "I want to keep it that way. And he said, whenever any problem comes up in connection with the taverns, I want to be able to speak knowing what I'm talking about. So I want you on there because I know how you stand." So I said, "Well, all right." So I was on there for 16 years. And that's the way it started. They tried several times to get me to run for mayor, but that was too political for me. I just wouldn't do it. And finally, when we were having difficulty getting somebody to run on the Republican ticket, Dick, somebody got Dick interested, Dick Odell. His lives and ours have been just tied together for 35 years. And he thought that I was playing hard to get, And he should have known better than that. But I had to work pretty hard to convince him. "No, Dick, I'm not kidding you at all. You won't be stepping on my toes. I am not going to run." All right, then he would. So we put him right in. And then, well, that's not a part of my life story. If I go on from there, that would be his. But I when he agreed to go on Parkland then, I could retire gracefully because I knew that my place would be taken with a man who in some ways would be better than I was, and there would be no break. Monticello would have this representation. So I was able to move out, even though I didn't want to yet. I would have gone on to this day if it hadn't been for the things that commenced to develop that made me feel that I had to use my head and decide that the sensible thing was to get out of there. Because eventually, of course, people would get saying, "Well, that old buzzard's been in there too long, let's get him out of there." And I didn't want to go through that. And at the same time, a man who can't hear very well isn't very good on a board, because he can't make a contribution to the decision-making process unless he has heard what the others said. And if he's guessing at what they said, he's foot in his mouth. So I just snuck out.
When did you start to play tennis?
I started to play tennis in 1927 or 28, when I was pretty old to be starting a new type game. But small towns, and I was at Saragordo in those years, didn't have the facilities or the money or the interest in maintaining such a thing as a nice tennis court like we have down here now, for example. So, but shortly after that, we had a little old court. We played a little bit there in Saragordo, but shortly after that, we registered in summer school, and the superintendent was working on his master's too when I was working on mine. So for 4 summers, we played quite a bit of tennis on the stadium courts, just during those 2 months of the summer. But during the rest of the time, back in the small towns where I lived, there was almost never a decent court to play on. And so I played very little other than what I played over there. And that was mixed in with golf. We played golf that summer too, played golf and tennis both. But then in about 1953 3 or 4, somebody got the school board interested down here in building a couple of tennis courts there by the old football field. And the backstops were, space wasn't quite long enough. Back courts were shallow, but it was a pretty decent place to play. And Bob Kaiser, John Stoddard, Paul Riley, and Keith Hudson got started playing. And then I immediately got interested again. But of course I was 50-some years old then, and I thought that was pretty old, and I probably wouldn't be able to play very long. But I got started playing, and my friend Herbert Kaiser, do you know him?
No, I don't. I know the name, but I don't know who he is.
He's in Africa right now, incidentally, who's just 2 days younger than I am. He got interested too, because we were the same age, and if I could play, he could play, and he had been quite a tennis player when he was young. Had learned young and had lots of good strokes that I didn't have at all. But I was more active, easier, quicker on my feet than he was, because he was a little heavy. And so we became nip and tuck. I would beat him because I could run quicker and so forth, but he beat me because he could handle the racket so much better. So we carried on that way for about 15 years until we were just about 70. Then he got involved in more business ventures, and he likes to travel. He just travels all over the place, China, Japan, Europe, all the time. And so that broke up our singles playing together, and by that time I was beginning to get a little too old to play singles. But I kept going with Paul Riley and Keith Hudson and some of them down there. And at 65, I had got hold of Bob Miller and had him take some pictures of Herb Kaiser and me on our 65th birthdays playing tennis. Well, it didn't turn out too well. It was a very cloudy day, and the photography wasn't as good then as it is now. Because I suppose when you're 65, you surely won't play much longer. And but I found that it's a day at a time, a week at a time, a month at a time, a year at a time. And here I am approaching 82 and still playing tennis once a week. Don't ask me how well I play.
Well, Mr. Barnes, I have certainly enjoyed talking to you, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Well, I enjoyed it too, as far as that's concerned. I always feel after it's over in interviews like this that I have talked entirely too much, but then that's what you asked me to do.
That's what we want.
1933, the year before our first child was born, we decided to go with some friends of ours he was a dyed-in-the-wool Westerner who had become a school teacher out here, but always went back in the summertime. And we were going to travel with them. We took 2 cars, and we left Cerro Gordo May the 29th, 1933, spent 2 or 3 days at the World's Fair in Chicago, and took off for the west. And one of the high spots of the summer was climbing the Grand Teton. It was a 2-day deal, and we started on noon on August the 7th, very warm, very hot. And our wives took us to the spot about where this picture was taken, which was about 5 miles from the mountain, from the peak. Then we took didn't take very heavy packs, but we had packs on our backs, and took off on foot, hobnail boots and so forth, and a rope let's see, we had, I don't know what we took in the way of food, but he was a pretty good cook. He was quite an outdoor man. And we found the cave where we were supposed to spend the night. Got in there probably about 7 o'clock in the evening after some pretty hard hiking. Still not above timberline. And this cave was had an opening only about half the size of an ordinary door, but it was a dry cave, and the forest rangers, kept fresh evergreen boughs cut in there for a mattress, and there were even some old blankets in there. So we spent the night in there after we had a bite to eat, cooked over an outdoor fire. And my friend said, "You see those eyes over there?" I said, that's a pack rat, sometimes called trader rats. And he said they're called that because they will, if they see something bright in your belongings, they will snitch it and replace it with a rock or something. They trade it. I didn't like the idea of rats being around, but in due time, when it got dark, we crawled in, and I thought, I don't know whether I can sleep in this place or not. But I hadn't quite gotten to sleep, but almost, when something ran across my feet. I was in a sleeping bag, of course. We had our sleeping bags. And I thought, now I know I can't sleep. But that I jumped and kicked a little bit, and that thing disappeared. And that's the last I remember, because I'd been thinking all summer trying to get my nerve up. But when we got around in our travels we'd been in the West for 2 months, got there, and here we weren't going to get to go because it was raining. Tom was pretty wise. He said, let's just watch it for a while. Said these storms in the mountains like this come up and they disappear just as fast as almost. Well, by 9 o'clock it was clearing up. So we started up. We didn't go very far. The going got pretty rough then. But we started on up, and in just no time, the rain had turned to snow. And here was fresh snow on August the 8th. Well, that meant as you pulled up on the rocks, you wanted to be sure that your fingers weren't numb from the cold, so you'd brush the snow off and pull up. But we made it, and most of the going was, except the last 1,000 feet, was just trudging upward and just hard work. Pretty rocky in places. We'd throw a rope over a point and try it, and then pull up and and then went for another spot to get a foothold. But there were 2 places that were especially bad, and I'd heard about them all the past year because this man had climbed it the previous summer. His first climbing of it. You have to go. But one place was called Belly Roll Rock, and it was right on the edge of a 3,000-foot drop. And there was there was a rock that had partly broken loose, but was still there, about 6 or 7 feet long, and sloped inward so that you could lie across it and hold your hands in those cracks and roll across to get over to the ledge, which was the only path we had, was the ledge along there. And that took every ounce of the nerve I had, because I had never seen a mountain until that summer. But we made it. And the other one, not too far on, was the Crawl Rock, as they called it. Some early mountain climbers way back someplace had blasted and chipped out of a sheer angle rock a slope or a ledge just wide enough for you to get under, and it had a rock roof so that you had to crawl across, and with the pack on your back you had to get pretty low to keep, and that was just right, just off to your left hand was a drop of 3,000 feet, and that thing must have been 20 feet across, but we made it, needless to say. And then the last 1,000 feet or so consisted mostly of chimneys, The water through the years, the snow, melting snow from the top had washed out and left ridges of upright rock pillars. No vegetation of any kind left. We were up above that. And some of those, well, the problem was that some of those chimneys were dead end at the bottom. Of course, we were on the way up, and we always were on a ledge, and so we know which one to take. But from the top, my friend said, you don't know which one to start down. So he took care of that by building what he called a cairn, a peculiar little arrangement of rocks, at the one we wanted, so it would be there when we came back down, and we wouldn't get into a dead end and go down that. And those places were pretty rough going. You'd brace your back against one side of a little rock groove, and places to take the rope, and places help one another, and you'd just inch your way up. We got up there about 3:30 in the afternoon, and it was a little bit hazy, but it was a marvelous experience. The other mountains in that range are all shorter than the Grand. There's a whole bunch of them, and we could look down on mountains 11 and 12,000 feet high. This was 13,755. And my friend, who was well acquainted in the whole western area, and he made up for what he didn't know by what he could imagine and talk about. And he said we could see 4 states from there: Idaho, of course, Wyoming, Colorado, and I guess Montana, which was behind. We had come from Montana. But anyway, we enjoyed that very much, except I was all jittery about the terrible going down. But on top, there's a great big scroll, copper tube, with a big scroll in it, copper tube with a cap. And the copper tube is wired to the rocks, because the storms up there are terrific in the winter, and it's wired with heavy cable. So we opened it up and pulled out the scroll, and sure enough, in August of 1932, here was Tom Edwards' name and Henry Pitt's, the two that had climbed it before, and a few women's names were on there from the East Coast. But we signed our names on that scroll and screwed the cap back on and took off and came down with no mishaps. But my friend later, that next year during school, he made talks around about our trip, and he always managed to mention, well, I'd left my fingerprints in those rocks out there, which was almost the truth. But we got down then just at dusk, and the girls were back at that spot where they had let us off. It was a car, and I tell you, that was
that's quite an experience.
That's really quite a day.
Well, I do thank you again.
Yeah.